Hohenzollern Castle looks like it was plucked straight out of a storybook. Towers and turrets rise from the clouds, perched nearly 900 meters above sea level on a lonely mountain in southern Germany. Over 300,000 tourists visit every year. They take selfies on the ramparts, marvel at the gilded ceilings, and post the photos to Instagram with captions about fairy tales. But the family who built this castle presided over one of the darkest legacies in European history: wars, genocide, a deal with Adolf Hitler, and a ghost story so persistent that it terrified Napoleon himself. This is the real story of Hohenzollern Castle, and by the end that fairy tale is going to look very different. If you want more stories like this, the real history behind places that look beautiful on the surface but hide something much darker, make sure you are subscribed. These stories only get worse the deeper you go. To understand this castle, you have to go back nearly 1,000 years. The first fortress on Mount Hohenzollern was built sometime around 1040 by the Counts of Zollern, a minor noble family in the Swabian Alps of what is now southwestern Germany. Contemporary sources called it the crown of all castles in Swabia and the strongest house in German lands. The mountain itself was a natural fortress with steep slopes on every side, and an undetected approach was almost impossible. But in 1423, a fateful conflict changed everything. Burgrave Friedrich XII, known as the Oettinger, had a habit of antagonizing the free cities of the Swabian region. He was aggressive and reckless, and eventually the cities had enough. Under the leadership of Countess Henriette of Württemberg, the Swabian League of Cities marched on the castle and laid siege. They could not storm the mountain, so they starved it. For 10 grueling months, the defenders held out while food dwindled and hope faded. Friedrich's bride, known as the Maid of Mossinger, reportedly disguised herself and smuggled supplies up the mountain by night. It bought them time, but not enough. On May 15th, 1423, the castle fell. The fortress was destroyed. The Oettinger was imprisoned, and that first Hohenzollern Castle was reduced to rubble. Now here is where the story takes a turn you will not find in the tourist brochure. This is the turn in the tale. There is a legend that has followed the Hohenzollern family for over 600 years. The legend of the White Lady. Depending on which version you hear, she is either the ghost of a grief-struck noblewoman or a cold-blooded killer. The most common version names Countess Kunigunde of Orlamunde, a young widow who fell desperately in love with Albrecht of Zollern and Nuremberg, a Hohenzollern prince. Albrecht rejected her. He told her there were 4 eyes in the way. He meant his parents. Kunigunde understood something far worse. She believed he was talking about her 2 young sons from a previous marriage. In a moment of madness driven by obsession, she killed both of them. Some tellings say she used a spindle. Others say she drove needles into their skulls. When Albrecht discovered what she had done, he was horrified. He never married her. Kunigunde died consumed by guilt and shame. According to the legend, her spirit never rested. She became the White Lady, a veiled figure in white who appears in Hohenzollern residences to foretell death and disaster. Reported sightings stretch across centuries. In 1486, the White Lady appeared at Plassenburg Castle just days before a Hohenzollern war hero died. In 1628, she reportedly appeared to a young Hohenzollern prince and spoke the words, "Come, I judge the living and the dead," in Latin. He died the following day. In 1667, Louise Henrietta of Orange saw the White Lady sitting at her writing desk. She was dead within days. In 1678, the Margrave Erdmann Philip of Brandenburg entered his chamber at Bayreuth and found the White Lady sitting in his armchair. He stumbled back in terror. The next morning his horse threw him in the courtyard. 2 hours later, he was dead. Even Frederick I nearly died of fright. While recovering from illness, he saw a white-robed figure glide into his room and extend her arms toward him. It turned out to be his wife, who suffered from mental illness, but the shock destroyed what was left of his health. He died months later. And then there is Napoleon. In 1806, after conquering Prussia, Bonaparte spent a single night in the former Bayreuth palace of the Hohenzollerns. Whatever he experienced that night disturbed him so deeply that he left the next morning and reportedly called it Le Maudit Chateau, the cursed castle. The last reported sighting of the White Lady happened in early November 1918. A palace watchman at the Berlin Palace claimed to see a veiled woman in white wandering the halls at night. She vanished when he approached. Days later, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled into exile. The Hohenzollern monarchy was over. If the legends are to be believed, the White Lady had delivered her final warning. But the real darkness of the Hohenzollern story is not supernatural, it is historical, and it begins with how this minor Swabian family rose to become one of the most dominant dynasties in European history. The second castle was built on the same mountain between 1454 and 1461. It was larger and sturdier than the first, designed to withstand exactly the kind of siege that had destroyed its predecessor. And during the 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, it served as a refuge for the Catholic Swabian Hohenzollerns, while armies tore across the German countryside. But even this fortress eventually fell. It was besieged again during that war. Its defenders starved out after 9 months. Then the Austrians took control. Then the French occupied it during the War of the Austrian Succession. By the late 1700s, it was little more than a romantic wreck on a mountaintop. The last Austrian occupant walked away in 1798. Only a single medieval chapel survived the decay. Meanwhile, the family itself had split into branches that stretched far beyond Swabia. The Franconian branch had become burgraves of Nuremberg, then electors of Brandenburg in the 1400s. By 1701, they crowned themselves kings of Prussia. They built Berlin into a capital of military ambition. They conquered Silesia, partitioned Poland, and forged an army that terrified the rest of Europe. And after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Otto von Bismarck unified Germany under Hohenzollern rule. They became German emperors, a family that had started as minor counts on a Swabian hilltop, now controlled one of the most formidable nations on earth. In 1819, Crown Prince Frederick William of Prussia visited the ruins of his family's ancestral castle and was so moved by the sunset from the crumbling bastions that he vowed to rebuild it. When he became King Frederick William IV, he hired the architect Friedrich August Stuhler to create a neo-Gothic masterpiece inspired by English castles and French chateaux. Construction began in 1850 and was completed in 1867. The result was breathtaking, a horseshoe-shaped fortress with 140 rooms, towering ramparts, and a bastion ring designed by military architect Moritz von Prittwitz. It contained gilded, coffered ceilings, marquetry floors, and portraits of Prussian royalty. The crown of Kaiser Wilhelm II was placed inside. So were personal effects of Frederick the Great and even a letter from George Washington. But here is the irony that tells you everything about this family. No Hohenzollern ever actually lived in this castle. Not the king who built it. Not the 3 German emperors who followed. It was a monument to a dynasty's ego, not a home. Frederick William IV died in 1861 before it was even finished, and the Kaisers who came after him never bothered to move in. The castle was a fairy tale. The family's actual legacy was something else entirely. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany launched itself into colonial conquest. And in 1904, in the colony of German Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, the Hohenzollern Empire committed what historians recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. The Herero people had risen up against brutal colonial rule. German settlers had been stealing their land, confiscating their cattle, and subjecting them to forced labor for years. When the Herero revolted in January 1904, Kaiser Wilhelm sent General Lothar von Trotha with thousands of troops and orders to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. Von Trotha cornered the Herero at Waterberg, defeated them in battle, and then pursued the survivors, men, women, and children, into the Omahiki Desert. Thousands died of thirst and starvation. Water wells were poisoned. On October 2nd, 1904, Trotha issued his infamous extermination order. Every male Herero within the German borders was to be shot on sight, armed or not. Women and children were to be driven back into the desert. By the time the order was rescinded months later, the damage was catastrophic. The Herero population collapsed from roughly 80,000 to around 15,000. Survivors were forced into concentration camps where mortality rates reached as high as 74%. Prisoners endured forced labor and medical experiments. The Nama people who also rebelled suffered a similar fate. At least 10,000 Nama were killed. These were not random acts of battlefield cruelty. They were systematic methods of annihilation, death marches, concentration camps, extermination orders that would be repeated decades later during the Holocaust. Some of the perpetrators of the Herero genocide went on to develop policies that would be used in the so-called final solution, and all of this happened under the Hohenzollern crown. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover dark history and heritage every week. World War I ended in disaster for Germany, and the Hohenzollerns were swept from power in November 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile in the Netherlands, where he spent the rest of his life nursing bitter grievances. In private letters, his anti-Semitism grew extreme. He blamed Jewish people for the fall of the monarchy in language so vile it reads like it could have been written by a Nazi propagandist. But the real damage to Germany's future came from his son, Crown Prince Wilhelm. The self-proclaimed heir to the throne was determined to destroy the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had replaced the monarchy. He believed backing the far right would eventually lead to a restoration of Hohenzollern power, and that's exactly what led him to Adolf Hitler. In the spring of 1932, during the second round of the German presidential elections, Crown Prince Wilhelm publicly endorsed Hitler over the incumbent president, Paul von Hindenburg. This was not a minor gesture. The Hohenzollern name still carried enormous weight among conservative and monarchist Germans. The endorsement gave Hitler something he desperately needed, an air of legitimacy among the old establishment. Then came March 21st, 1933, the day of Potsdam. It was a carefully staged ceremony at the Garrison Church in Potsdam, designed to show continuity between the old Prussian monarchy and Hitler's new government. The Crown Prince attended in full view of the cameras. The image of Hitler bowing before the elderly Hindenburg, with the former heir to the throne looking on approvingly, became one of the most effective propaganda images of the early Nazi era. The Crown Prince continued to support the regime throughout the 1930s. When Hitler launched military campaigns during World War II, the Crown Prince sent personal telegrams of congratulation addressed to Mein Führer. He lent his name and his family's prestige to a movement that would go on to commit the worst atrocities in human history. It was only when the Nazis consolidated power and realized they did not need the monarchists anymore that the relationship cooled. Monarchist organizations were banned in 1934, a Hohenzollern prince was killed fighting for the German army in 1940, and the public sympathy at his funeral alarmed Hitler so much that he banned all former German royals from military service. The Hohenzollerns had helped open the door to fascism, and fascism slammed it in their faces. After the war, the Soviet occupation authorities seized Hohenzollern properties across eastern Germany. The palaces, the art collections, the land, all of it vanished behind the Iron Curtain. Hohenzollern Castle itself, located in the west, survived. It remained in family hands, but everything else was gone, and for decades that seemed like the end of the story. Then the Berlin Wall came down. After German reunification in 1990, the government passed a law allowing families to reclaim property seized by the Soviets. But the law had one critical condition: if the former owners or their ancestors had provided substantial support to the Nazi regime, no compensation would be granted. In 2014, Georg Friedrich, Prince of Prussia, the great-great-grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, began negotiating with the German government for the return of tens of thousands of artworks, antiquities, rare books, and pieces of furniture held in public museums. He also requested the right to live in Sicilienhof Palace, a 176-room museum in Potsdam. He sought compensation of at least 1.2 million euros. The negotiations were conducted in secret for years, but in 2019, details leaked to the German press, and the public reaction was furious. Historians testified before the German parliament about the crown prince's role in Hitler's rise. 3 out of 4 experts concluded that the crown prince had considerably abetted the Nazi regime. A 1934 photograph surfaced, showing the crown prince in a stormtrooper uniform. German satirist Jan Böhmermann leaked confidential expert reports and mocked Georg Friedrich on national television in a segment that now has over 4 million views. The Green Party argued there should be no compensation for Hitler's helpers. Even conservative politicians were uncomfortable with the scale of the family's demands. Georg Friedrich eventually withdrew many of his claims in 2023, calling his ancestors' involvement with the Nazis indefensible. And in 2025, the German government and the Hohenzollern family finally reached a settlement. Thousands of disputed artworks and artifacts were transferred to a new charitable foundation under state control. The family retained ownership of a small number of items. Sicilienhof will remain a public museum, but the debate revealed something deeper than a legal dispute over property. It forced Germany to confront an uncomfortable question: how do you reconcile a fairy tale castle with a legacy that includes colonial genocide, world war, and collaboration with fascism? Today, Hohenzollern Castle still rises above the Swabian countryside like something from a dream. The family flag still flies on the tower when Prince Georg Friedrich and his family are in residence. Tourists still marvel at the crown of Wilhelm II. They still take photos on the ramparts and call it magical. But the stones of that castle have absorbed 1,000 years of ambition, violence, and reckoning. 3 fortresses have stood on that mountain. Each one was built by a family that believed it was destined to rule, and each time that belief led to catastrophe. The White Lady, if you believe the legends, appeared one final time before the monarchy collapsed. Maybe she was a warning, maybe she was a curse, or maybe she was just history, doing what it always does, catching up. If you want to see another story about a landmark hiding a dark past, please subscribe.